Please join me in welcoming today's guest speaker, Scott J. Lee, Esquire. He's a Florida Bar Board certified attorney, not only in real estate law, but also condominium and planned development law. We're very, very happy to have him here. He's got deep experience in community associations, governance, and property law. Scott brings a wealth of insight to some of these issues that we're going to be dealing with House Bill 913 that affect all of us. He is a trusted legal advisor and the principal attorney at SJW Law Group based in Wellington, Florida. He's going to walk us through today all the key elements and the implications of Florida House Bill 913. It impacts what we do, how we operate, how we communicate with homeowners, and more importantly, manage records and some additional responsibilities as well. If we could just give Scott a nice, warm affinity welcome. Scott, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Colin. I really appreciate the opportunity to give this presentation and to discuss House Bill 913. It seems like every few months there are changes, legislative changes that us community association attorneys and you guys as property managers have to learn about and understand and try and figure out the nuances. It's challenging. So I applaud you and thank you for attending today, whether it's mandatory or voluntary. It's great to have you here. Yeah, I've been practicing law 31 years. Can't believe it's 31 at this point, but time flies when you're sort of having fun. And I represent about 200 or so communities, condominium associations, homeowners associations, and co-ops. There actually are a few co-ops in the state of Florida. I am based in Wellington, Florida, in Palm Beach County, and I handle all the day-to-day stuff that goes on, as you guys do, with regard to the community associations I represent, from their covenant enforcement, their collections, their amendments to their governing documents, and a good portion of my day is answering questions from fine folks such as yourself, as well as the boards of directors that I interface with on a daily basis. So I'm in the trenches with you guys, with the communities that I represent. Use me as a resource, not just, hopefully you'll have some strong takeaways today from the seminar, but on a go-forward basis, I put my contact information in the chat, my phone number, my cell phone number, and don't hesitate to use that. It's fine, as well as my email address. If you have follow-up questions, whether it's as it relates to this particular presentation or some other issue that comes up down the road, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I want to share the knowledge that I have, plus, of course, strengthen my relationship with your management company. So big, broad overview. So there's two parts to the presentation. The first part really deals exclusively with management companies and you guys and property managers and how HB 913 deals with management companies and your obligations as property managers. And then when we are done with the PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to talk about everything else in House Bill 913, and there's quite a bit. So I'm not going to have a fancy PowerPoint presentation. You're going to, unfortunately or fortunately, have to stare at my mug for the balance of the seminar after we go through PowerPoint presentation. Let's jump right into it. The purpose of HB 913, as it states there, to increase accountability and transparency in community association management, builds trust between managers, associations, and residents, aligns with affinity core values, integrity, service, and accountability. What's going on behind the scenes here? Aside from, in a way, making your life more difficult as a property manager and for property management companies. Much of the legislation, including this bill, particularly as it relates to management companies, and the previous legislation, which really, you'll hear some editorializing from me today, which I hope you don't mind. But in July of 2024, if you are a property manager for a homeowners association, this, by the way, does not deal at all with homeowner associations in terms of the second part of the presentation. But the legislation July 1st, 2024 was kind of a full frontal attack on homeowners associations, really driven by maybe one or two communities in Miami where there was some form of untoward action by boards of directors, some criminal activity, some embezzlement. So typical of our friends in Tallahassee, there's a bit of an overreaction, when they hear of some of these anecdotal stories about communities and boards of directors, and in the very rare case, a property manager that is colored outside the lines, so to speak. And what you get in response is legislation like what we saw July 1st, 2024 involving HOAs, and to some degree, HB 913 as involving community association management companies and property managers. I'm not saying that this particular bill doesn't have its fine points, but that's what's going on behind the scenes. Nonetheless, it's the law, so we got to comply with it, good, bad, whatever the motivation. So again, increase accountability, transparency, community association management, building trust. And of course, these concepts align with your company's core values. So in a way, it makes a lot of sense, but let's go through the details. But more broad strokes first. The bill involves online licensure accounts that are now mandatory for managers and management company firms. Updating that information is important, and notifications of license suspensions and revocations triggers a whole series of things. I can't imagine any of our fine folks on this call will be dealing with license suspensions or revocations, but it's part of the bill. So managers must identify their firm and each association served. So that's an important thing to be aware of, because particularly for portfolio managers, some of them might be here, you have a whole bevy of communities that you provide property management services. So you have to identify each and every one of those communities with DBPR. So be aware of that. And as things change, you have to update the DBPR within 30 days. So don't delay. Licensing restrictions after revocation. Again, I'm sure this doesn't apply to anyone here, but just know 10-year ban on ownership, employment, or leadership in management firms after revocation. And the department notifies firms and associations of suspensions and revocations. Okay, next slide. This is important. Conflict of interest disclosures, the mandatory disclosure of potential conflicts to association boards. So listen, you should be really wary of engaging in situations where there is a potential conflict of interest. For example, your cousin owns the landscaping company that you're recommending to the community. Maybe your cousin is the best landscaping company out there, but you may want to shy away from that, because if the landscaping company does something wrong, who are they going to blame? You for recommending your cousin's management landscaping company. So yeah, be attuned to that issue. It applies to managers, firms, officers, and individuals. So it's a very broad scope in terms of the conflict. So if it's your wife's company, but it's not your company, and she's the sole owner of the landscaping company or the accounting firm or whatever, it's a conflict of interest in terms of mandatory disclosures. And if it's not disclosed, it's presumed to be a conflict. If you have one of these situations where there's a related individual who owns or has an interest in the vending company. All right, next, thanks. Manager duties and prohibitions. I'm sure most of you guys are doing this, but there are a few communities out there that just don't do any meetings, which is a no-no. And I recommend, even for small associations, even for associations with not a lot of business going on, you should be doing meetings fairly regularly. And what I mean by fairly regularly, at least every other month. Even if it's a 10-minute meeting, I think it's just good practice, because I've seen it too often that in communities that just didn't go through the niceties and the formalities of running a community, later on, there's always complaints that there was a lack of transparency, a lack of communication, a lack of an ability to raise issues to the board of directors. So schedule boards of directors meetings, as regularly as, seems practical. And for you guys, you have a duty and obligation to attend at least one board meeting annually in person. So be aware of that new obligation, even though you're probably already doing that. You have to provide the membership with your contact information and a description of your responsibilities, which the second part I find a little humorous in describing responsibilities. I'm not sure how you could describe everything possible within the community, because that's kind of what you do as a property manager. But do your best to summarize it, detail it, and in that situation, less is not more, more is more. So be comprehensive in terms of the description of your responsibilities. You have a duty to update the website online with this information within 30 days of any changes. So a member has to be able to get in touch with you. That's fair. That makes sense. And if your email address changes, the phone number changes, you do have to update it, like I said, within that 30-day period. Also, if a member wants to get a copy of the management contract, they have to make it, you guys have to make it available. Now, listen, management contracts are an official record anyway. So it's subject to the official records request procedure. But let's say someone asked for it informally, not in conformance with the official records request procedure. Because of this new law, I wouldn't stand on ceremony and say, you didn't send in a proper official records request. I would just give them the management contract. If it's not already available online, which it should be, and you could just point to it online for them, which is the easier way. This is a great one too, this final bullet point, because you guys are sometimes, and I'm in that situation too, where you have a board that maybe wants to go their own way and doesn't really much care about the recent legislative changes or existing law or what their attorney is telling them to do to stay out of trouble. But they're directing you to do A, B, and C, which you kind of know is not appropriate. It's not consistent with your governing documents, which is not consistent with Chapter 718, Florida's Condominium Act, or 719, or the Cooperative Act, 720, the HOA Act. This law now says you are, and I think this gives you ammunition, honestly. And I think this is helpful for you in the sense that if you have a very difficult board member, particularly usually a president, who's commanding you to take certain action, you could now point to this law and say, I am prohibited from doing what you're asking me from doing. And I could get, my license could be suspended or revoked. There's a legislative enactment that specifically expressly states I'm prohibited from knowingly violating any laws, even if directed by you as a board member, and kind of like my employer in a way. So use that as a tool when you know something is improper and being forced upon you by a board member. Next one. Contracts, your property management contracts, which this is more for the regional directors, must include the required legal statement in 12-point font. What is that 12-point statement? Let's see. Quote unquote, the community association manager shall abide by all professional standards and record and record keeping requirements imposed pursuant to Part 8 of Chapter 468 Florida statutes. That's the statement that must be embedded in each one of your management contracts. So again, more of a regional director thing, but if you're the facilitator of having the management contract signed, maybe just give it a look, make sure that statement is in there. And I highly doubt your management contract does this, but you can't be any waivers or limitations on professional standards. You can't contract away your obligation to comply with law, basically. All right, next one, Colin. So like with any legislation, just like HB 913, what you get is follow-up guidance from the department. So look for that. I mean, this law is brand new. Just hit the books and effective July 1st. So there's always questions, and because of a bit of ambiguity or vagaries in the language itself. So DBPR will fill in the gaps or give some explanation as to what some of these requirements call for in greater detail. So that could be coming. And the last bullet point, prepare for compliance, update accounts, review contracts, train staff. That just goes along with all the points that I've raised. All right, next one. All right, quiz time. Test your knowledge. What is the main purpose of HB 913? Reduce paperwork, increase accountability and transparency, lower licensing fees, eliminate licensure requirements. Well,
B.
I think we could all hazard a guess that it is B. Increase accountability and transparency. HB 913 was enacted to strengthen accountability and transparency. Some may say additional obligations to be placed on management companies and property managers, but okay. Ensuring ethical practices and better protection for associations. Managers must update their online licensor account within how many days of a change? We went through this a few times.
30.
The answer is C. All right, 30. See that one? Okay. If a manager's license is revoked, how long are they prohibited from working in management firms?
5 years.
Any guesses?
Keep going.
See? There
Or
we go.
10.
So
You're out
Bottom
for
line,
10
don't-
years.
don't do anything that exposes you to a revocation or a suspension, because it's a 10-year situation. Who must disclose potential conflicts of interest? Only managers, only firms, managers, firms, officers, and related individuals, only association board members. I think we're seeing a pattern here in terms of the
C.
answers. So we're going to say C once again. I think when I studied for the LSATs and the SATs, they always told me to guess C anyway, if I didn't know. So this, I guess, test is very similar. Guess C if you're not sure. Managers, firms, officers, and related individuals. The conflict of interest disclosure stuff is really important. So if you feel as if there could be some level of conflict due to the association choosing a particular vendor, probably won't need to check with the association council to know exactly what you need to do, because there are a few steps here. Which of the following is not a new manager duty? Attend one board member meeting annually. That doesn't sound like a right one. Provide contact info to members. Update website info within 30 days. Approve all board decisions. All right, I'm going to give you a hint. It's not C this time. And the answer is D. Approve all board decisions. That's never been the case. So managers are not responsible for approving board decisions, first off. And if there's a board decision that violates a law, it's your obligation and duty to say, I'm not following through with that instruction. Contracts for management services must include what? A waiver of legal standards, a required legal statement in 12-point font. I think we heard something along those lines a few
B.
minutes ago. A confidentiality clause, an arbitration agreement, and the answer is B. A required legal statement that I read off in that 12-point font. Next. Managers of the firms are prohibited from making recommendations to the board, performing acts that violate laws even if directed, attending meetings, posting information online. The easy one.
B.
B. Very good. Right. You should be doing the other things, making recommendations to the board, attending meetings, posting information online, but not performing acts that violate laws. Which affinity core value is demonstrated by promptly updating licensure requirements, licensure accounts, right? I'm sorry. Teamwork, professionalism, celebrating wins, relationship focused.
All of them.
I think teamwork could apply too, but professionalism sounds like the best answer, so we'll go with B. And what happens if a conflict of interest is not disclosed in advance? A, no action is required. B, it is presumed to be a conflict. C, the contract is automatically terminated. D, the manager is promoted. D's the funniest, so, but I wouldn't go with D. The answer is B. It is presumed to be a conflict. What happens if a conflict of interest is not disclosed in, oh, we just, okay. What, next one? What should managers expect next regarding HB 13? Just heard this, no further action, or B, department guidance and compliance instructions. Sounds like the right one. Reduced responsibilities, elimination of licensor accounts. Of course, it's B. 1.3 as it relates to you guys and management companies, property managers. Well, now there's a whole bunch of juicy substantive stuff that you still got to know. That doesn't deal directly with property management companies, but it falls within your day-to-day and as well as the board members day-to-day. So as it relates to this part 2 of our presentation, if you are a property manager strictly and exclusively for homeowners associations, now would be a very good time to take a nap or go get a snack, because this does not apply to homeowners associations at all. It only applies to condominium associations and cooperatives, okay? So this is not for homeowner associations. Now I'm just going to rattle off in no particular order of importance the stuff, for lack of a better word, that HB 913 touches upon as involving condos and co-ops. So it modifies 718.111 subsection 11, revising the adequate insurance coverage obligation. So, you know, for condominium associations, the structure, the common elements must have adequate insurance coverage, which previously must have been based upon the replacement cost of the property. So that kind of tied everyone's hands a little bit. Replacement cost of the property, it could be a big number, which is causing insurance premiums to go up, among other reasons. So now this legislation says that the insurance coverage may be based upon the replacement cost of the property. Us attorneys live in the world of the mays and the musts, the permissives and the mandatories. So I guess this is the legislature's effort to soften a little bit the insurance requirements for condominium associations by giving some latitude to the boards of directors and through you guys, as well as the insurance agents, to come up with adequate insurance coverage, which could be based on something other than just replacement cost. So hopefully your insurance brokers and insurance companies can get creative to come up with adequate insurance coverage formulas that lessen the premium. And this legislation will assist in that regard. Official records, 718.111, subsection 12. Let me just say this before I get into the bullet points on this. Official records, I think for myself to some degree, but even more so for you guys as property managers, might be the bane of your existence. These things are not fun to deal with, when they come in from members. And it always comes from 1 or 2 members routinely, the same folks who are demanding copies of documents to try and find some type of gotcha, typically. Sometimes it's a well-intentioned request, which is fine, but just be on alert with these official records, because there are heavy penalties, not just monetary penalties that are imposed on the associations, up to $500, which doesn't seem like the end of the world. But first of all, the $500, if not complied with, they'll probably place it on the property management company to have to cut that check, if not complied with. But it also can and oftentimes results in lawsuits. And the lawsuits could result in liability that far exceed $500, because attorney's fees are at issue, because the prevailing party in lawsuits in fights over official records, whether it was timely produced or if the records were produced at all, or what records were protected and didn't have to be produced versus others that had to be. Typical example are board of directors emails, which is an area that is an evolving situation where some emails may have to be turned over and others may not be. So always check with association counsel when you get these official records requests. So you understand first, when it's due, which records requests are proper, because many times they come in a manner which can't even be responded to because they're so vague and overbroad. Good example is, please provide all financial records of the association for the previous 7 years. Well, that's basically every piece of paper that exists for your community. That is not a proper official records request. And there are arbitration decisions that go to great length to say the request has to be fairly detailed and specific and categorized. And asking for the universe of financial documents is not proper. And a legal response needs to be provided, to the member making that improper request. But be on alert when these requests come in. Probably have association counsel look it over, send a response if some of the requests are improper. You may want to consider rules and regulations pertaining to the records request, which I routinely prepare for my communities, that helps create some parameters, rules of the road. So protecting the association and protecting you guys in terms of what's fair and what's not fair. One good example, and I'm digressing a little bit, but it's okay, I guess. I create a rule that says you can't provide a request where you're asking for more than 5 categories of documents at a time. Because I've seen records requests come in asking for 37 different categories of documents, and you have to come up with these within 10 business days. That's a short period of time to gather up all that's being requested. So paring it down to no more than 5 at least gives you the ability to breathe, to gather up just those documents for those 5. And if there's a supplemental request thereafter, fine. There are other rules and regulations that you can put into place as well pertaining to the records requests that will help you and help the association. All right, into the legislation. Committee meeting minutes and recording of all association meetings conducted by video conference are now official records. This is a sea change whereby first of all, we'll get into something else as it relates to Zoom type meetings. Those have to be recorded, where previously they did not have to be recorded. And those recordations are now part of the official records and must be maintained for upwards of 1 year. So lots of folks like doing these Zoom meetings. I understand why, but make sure whichever format you're using, you have the ability to record and you have the ability to save the recording, and that recording can be stored along with the official records. Also, committee meeting minutes. Some of your communities have committees, some don't, but if they take meeting minutes, those are official records. All bank statements and ledgers are official records. So there's a question as to whether or not all banks, basically, that should have been part of your official records previously. This law clarifies all bank statements and ledgers are official records. A copy of all affidavits that are signed. Say, for instance, you do a special assessment meeting. Coupled with the notice of special assessment meeting, there should be an affidavit, typically signed by you guys, stating that the mailing went out at least 14 days in advance of the special assessment meeting. Well, that affidavit is now an official record, among a whole host of other affidavits that may come up in the course of your property management services. The legislation modifies the standard for criminal penalties. Again, we're still dealing with official records related to records requests from knowingly, willfully, and repeatedly to willfully and knowingly or intentionally. What it's basically doing is taking out the word repeatedly. So why are they doing that? Basically, one instance of denying someone an official records request can result in a criminal penalty, whether it's yourself or a board member that is intentionally stopping the production of official records without a solid basis. All the more reason You have to check with association council, let it fall on association council to make those decisions as to what should be produced or not produced. That way you and the board are protected and insulated from any potential criminal liability. The legislation requires an association to maintain an adequate number of copies of the association's most recent annual financial statements and annual budget on the condominium property. So if you're on site for your community, just make sure you have a whole bunch of copies of the annual financial statement and the annual budget. If someone knocks on your door, I would like a copy of this year's budget, please. You have to produce it. You can't say, I don't have any copies. I'll have to get it from the central office. That's not a good enough excuse. So just have a whole bunch of copies at the ready. New deadline for when an association must upload official records once received or created to the association's website, which is 30 days. So that's a good rule of thumb anyway, which is what I've been advising communities of. Well, I've been telling them, once it's created, as soon as possible, get it up there. Now you have a hard and fast deadline of 30 days. Additional new records to be posted on the website, approved minutes of all board meetings over the last 12 months. I just had mentioned the video recording or hyperlink to the video recording of all meetings of the association, as well as any committee meetings. If the committee was recording their meeting, those are official records as well. And I also mentioned the affidavits that are signed as part of the association business. All right, next big category, financial reporting. Florida Statute 718-111, subsection 13. This is a positive. Extends the deadline for providing a copy of end of year financial reports from 120 days to 180 days. This gives you a little bit more time because at the end of the year, when the fiscal period ends, almost always December 31st, the accounting firm they're jammed up, and sometimes they're not getting to these within that 120-day period. The legislature, I guess, recognized this and extended it by 60 days. Clarifies the requirement an association provide a copy of the financial report to each and every member, or this is kind of the better way, or a notice to each and every member that the financial report will be made available upon request. So I would do the latter. That way you don't have excessive mailing charges. But if someone says, yeah, I actually want the financial report, you got to provide it. New requirement that an affidavit be completed to evidence the compliance with the deadline for sending out the financial report. So if you're actually sending out the financial report to everyone, or if you're sending out the notice saying, hey, the financial reports are now available. If you want a copy, let me know. That should be coupled with an affidavit saying you sent out that notice or you actually sent out the financial reports. So this is a new affidavit requirement. Same category here, increases the voting threshold for approving a lesser degree of financial reporting from a majority of vote of those present to a majority of all voting interests. So if the board of directors is looking to get a slightly cheaper financial report, say going from an audit to a compilation, which is a lesser financial report, and save them $1,000, $1,500. They can do that, and that required previously a majority vote of the members present at a meeting where a quorum exists. But now you need a higher threshold. You need a majority of all voting interests. So making it a little more difficult to go down a level or two financial reporting wise. Next category, investment of association funds. There's a new section requiring the board to use their best efforts to make prudent investment decisions that carefully consider risk and return in an effort to maximize returns on invested funds. What does that mean? Well, it means don't take the reserve funds and put it in the stock market. And previously, maybe it was about 6 or 7 years ago, there was legislation that was being considered mandating that if an association, say, was going to take some of their monies and park it in a certificate of deposit, a money market account, an annuity, that they had to have a report from an investment advisor saying this is a good way to invest these monies. Now, this legislation does not go that far. It just says the board has to use its best efforts to make prudent investment decisions. But I'm an attorney, you're property managers. I really don't know what the most prudent investment decision may be for $500,000 of reserve monies. Maybe it is a CD, maybe it is annuity, maybe it's just putting it in a low yield money market account. That's why, even though the legislation doesn't require it, for your own protection, the board's protection, having an investment advisor provide some type of short opinion letter saying this is a good way to go with these monies, to park it in this particular vehicle, that gives insulation from this standard of making, or someone saying you didn't comply with the standard of making a prudent investment decision. So I would always recommend it to the board of directors to have an investment advisor help with this decision-making process and issue some form of an opinion letter to you and the board. Same category here, same subject, clarifies methods of investing association reserves funds, allows investing in one or more or a combination of CDs or in depository accounts at a community bank, savings bank, commercial bank, savings and loan, or credit union without a vote of the unit owner. So bottom line, yes, you can put it in the CD or potentially some other vehicle. You don't need a vote of the unit owners to do so, but I still go back to the suggestion that you may want to have an investment advisor, overlook the decision making here, because with CDs, you could be tied up in that CD for a year or 6 months or longer, who knows? And if the money needs to be pulled out for to do repairs, a milestone inspection report was generated saying you need concrete restoration tomorrow, and you don't have the money because it's tied up in a CD, there could be penalties that are going to be imposed. So that could be problematic. Hence the need for an investment advisor oversight. Okay, next subject in 913, board meetings. Clarifies a board meeting may be conducted in person or by video conference. A lot of us are doing that. It wasn't super clear before this legislation whether video conferences were all right, even though it was kind of suspected that it was okay and became the way of doing business post-COVID. And the division is going to, as we saw earlier, involving the legislation pertaining to you guys, the division is supposedly going to come up with some administrative code regulations down the road as it relates to how to conduct video conference board meetings. But Zoom meetings are perfectly fine. However, there's always a caveat. New requirement that notice for a board meeting conducted by video conference must state that the meeting will be held via video conference. That's kind of obvious, right? You're not going to create a notice of a board meeting, not make it clear. It could be handled by Zoom. The notice must include the hyperlink of the call and conference number for unit owners to attend the meeting. But you also have to list the address of the physical location where the unit owners can attend the meeting in person. Many community associations run afoul of this issue. And I've been advising my community association clientele that even though you want to hold your board meeting via Zoom, and even though you're telling me everyone loves it that way and no one wants to show up in person, technically, even before this legislation, and now it's codified, that you also have to offer a physical location for those members that aren't so handy on their laptop or don't know how to access Zoom. So you have to give a physical location for the meeting, and you have to give the person or persons who show up at the physical location the ability to access the meeting, by basically putting a laptop on a table for them and having someone assist with regard to them sitting in front of it. Requirement that all meetings conducted by video conference be recorded, we know that, and such recording be maintained as an official record, we said that already, and must be maintained for at least 1 year. I think I had mentioned that. This is a new requirement as it relates to the physical location for annual meetings It used to be the annual meeting only needed to be within 45 miles of the community. Now it's within 15 miles or within the same county. So, yeah, have to be a little bit closer in proximity to your community. And you can't, throw it all the way down 95 of the turnpike with the hope that people won't show up because they don't want to spend money on gas. So 15 miles. If a unit owner meeting is conducted via video conference, the unit owner may vote electronically in the manner provided by 718-128. We're going to get to more of this in a minute, but this is an important issue. Clarifies that unit owner meetings, including the annual meeting, may be conducted in person or video conference. If the annual meeting is conducted via video conference, this is a strange new requirement, by the way. A quorum of the members of the board must be physically present at the physical location where unit owners can attend the meeting. This does not make any sense, folks. Why would they say you could hold your annual meeting via video conference, but by the way, a quorum of the board has to be present physically at a certain location? Those two things are very difficult to reconcile, and shared my thoughts and heard comments from other community association attorneys like me saying this is illogical, but that is seemingly the requirement, that the physical location must be attended by a quorum of the board for the annual meeting. We're just talking about annual meetings now, right? I have a feeling there's going to be some corrective legislation involving that issue, but we'll see. If a unit owner meeting is conducted via video conference, a video conference must be recorded. And we already covered that. We covered that. All right, next. Budget meetings. Next topic. The legislation specifically authorizes budget meetings to be held by video conference. Okay, that's good. Consistent with our, the other legislation involving board meetings, and specifies that a sound transmitting device must be used so that the conversation may be heard. And so, all right, bottom line, budget meetings can be held by video conference and must be recorded. It's an official record. This is something new, so this is worth paying attention to. New requirement that if a board is proposing a budget which requires assessments which exceed 115% of assessments for the preceding year, the board, this used to fall on the membership. Now, if the board must simultaneously propose a substitute budget that does not include discretionary expenditures that are not required to be in the budget. All right, what does this mean? So you guys, particularly for condo associations, you're perhaps familiar with this 115% rule, where if a budget from year to year in the subsequent year exceeds 115% of the previous year, essentially a 15% increase, then a member can say, hey, I don't like this increased assessment on me so much. It's more than 15% from the previous year. I'm going to come up with my own substituted budget and get it before the membership and hope and see if the membership is interested in my budget as opposed to what you guys produce. Well, now they are saying, legislation says, well, if you cross this 115% threshold, that the board itself has to come up with a substituted budget. But there are a lot of carve-outs here in terms of what counts towards the budget for the calculation of the 115%. Reserves are not included. So with condos and co-ops, we're unfortunately getting clobbered because of the reserve requirement causing the budgets to increase significantly, which is pushing you in many communities over this 115% threshold. But for purposes of this legislation and this obligation to come up with a substituted budget, extract the reserves. So that may bring you back under that 115%. So be aware of that, as well as one-time repair requirements, as opposed to ongoing regular expenditures. So if you have a one-time hit, and say in 2025 or 2026, to replace a roof, to do concrete restoration, or there was an association liability related to a lawsuit, That's a one-time expenditure, not a reoccurring expense. Those expenses can be carved out and not included in this 115% figure. Let's put it this way. If your budget from year to year is exceeding 115%, we're going to have to get with association counsel and perhaps maybe an accounting firm just to go through these numbers and see what can legally be pulled out, to see if legally we have, you guys, the board, have to come up with a substituted budget or not. Regarding reserves and the mandatory reserves, you may recall that catch-all category, which was sweeping in a whole series of components where the repair or replacement costs exceeded $10,000, which was bringing in a lot of stuff into the SIRS report that was ballooning the reserve requirement. Well, the legislature increased that threshold down to $25,000. So only components that have a deferred maintenance or replacement cost which exceed $25,000, that would need to be included in your SIRS report. Again, these are the reserve specialists are the ones that figure all this stuff out. But it's good just to have that knowledge base. And this is helping a little bit in terms of removing certain required components from the reserve report compilation. New section 2, subsection F, subsection 2C, added 718.112, allows an association to fund SIRS reserves through regular assessments, special assessments, lines of credit, or loans. A line of credit, loan, or special assessment requires approval of a majority vote, the total voting interest of the association. This is just to fund the SIRS reserves. So that doesn't mean all special assessments now require a majority vote of the total voting interest of the association, because that's dictated by your declaration, by your governing documents, by your bylaws, by your articles. But if you're using that to fund your SIRS reserves, then you do need this vote, a majority vote of the total voting interest of the association. Allows an association to secure lines of credits to fund capital expenses required by the milestone inspection report. So same drill where you could get lines of credit, to pay for the repairs that the milestone inspection report is saying you need to deal with. The line of credit must be sufficient to fund the cumulative amount of any previously waived or unfunded portion of the reserve funding amount required for the reserves for the most recent SIRS. What does that all mean? It just means you have to get a line of credit that's sufficient, to cover, the cost of the needed repairs. So you can't just get a line of credit for just for a portion of it. And the funding for the line of credit must be immediately available. So the terms of the loan commitment letter, should always be looked at by association counsel, because if there are too many hoops that the association has to jump through in order to tap into the line of credit, say the bank requires a separate vote of the membership to access the line of credit when needed, that's improper and it's not going to be consistent with this legislative requirement. So we would have to carve that out of the loan commitment letter. So if there are lines of credit being considered by your community, that loan commitment letter is important to be looked at, regardless if it's related to funding SIRS reserves or any other reason. And lastly, the special assessment line of credit or loan must be included in the annual financial statement. Your accountants were preparing the reports, should know this, but just if you guys are involved in that, just make sure you're including that in the financial statements. Okay, we're still on reserve related issues. The legislation removed the requirement for member approval to pause contributions to reserves, reduce reserve funding if a local building official determines the entire condo is uninhabitable due to a natural emergency. So previously there was a voting requirement to get member approval to pause reserves. But if, I'm sure this doesn't involve any of your communities, but if a building official actually determined that it was uninhabitable, due to a hurricane or some other terrible casualty, then you don't need to get member approval to pause the contributions to reserves. Here's another big one, so let's pay attention to this bullet point. For a budget adopted on or before December 31st, 2028, that's right now, if an association has completed a milestone inspection within the previous 2 calendar years, the board, upon approval of a majority of the total voting interest, may temporarily pause for a period of no more than 2 years, reserve fund contributions, or reduce the amount of reserve funding for the purpose of funding repairs recommended by the milestone inspection. Let's break that down. Basically, the heavy reserve requirements that were thrust on everyone, that was locked in, and we're stuck with it. Well, there's a bit of a reprieve here, in the sense that if the total voting interest of the association votes to pause contributing to the reserves, that's okay, as long as the purpose of pausing the reserves, which can be paused only for 2 years, by the way, not forever, as long as the purpose of pausing the reserves is to deal with the repairs that are required by the milestone inspection report. I know that's a lot to digest, but this is technical stuff that, frankly, I had to read this through 4, 5, 6 times just to get my head around it. But anytime you're talking about pausing reserves, check with association council, see what's required. Membership meeting notices need to go out, limited proxies, a proper vote needs to be taken, and needs to be documented. What's the purpose? The purpose has to be tied to doing repairs as set forth in your acquired milestone inspection report. And once the association has done that and paused the reserve contributions, you must have a new SIRS report completed before the continuation of the reserve contributions in order to determine what the new reserve funding will be. Why? You haven't funded the reserves in the past 2 years, so you're backed up a little bit. So those 2 years of non-funding are now going to have to be newly calculated and incorporated into the go-forward reserve funding. Now, none of us are mathematicians, so that's why the SIRS specialists have to come up with a new report or an updated report. Probably updated is all it's needed, to account for the 2 years of paused reserve contributions. So that's an important thing. Also, this is a good thing. This permits the pooling of reserves for accounting purposes without having to get a membership vote. You may recall there are 2 different types of accounting methods. The straight line component method, which I like to call the silo method, where you have the roof, you have the exterior building envelope, you have paving the parking lot, you have pool resurfacing. Those are all individual components that have a separate reserve obligation over time. Monies for those special projects are put in individual silos. You can't take the monies from the roof replacement project and use it to pave the parking lot. That's the straight line component method of accounting. The more flexible method is the pooling method, where all the monies for all these component related projects are put into one pool. And you could use whatever portion of that pool for any one of these proper reserve related component projects. Even if you're using more money than you thought you needed, or you've actually allocated for one of the components, that's okay. It's giving you flexibility. And it's now, this legislation says you don't need membership approval to change the accounting method from straight line to pooling. The board could do that all by themselves. My recommendation is to do the pooling method because it creates flexibility, unless you have a widely irresponsible board who spends money like a drunken sailor. Then maybe the straight line component method is better. If they're not fiscally responsible and they take all the monies in the pool for just one of the component projects, leaving nothing for all the other component projects, then that's going to disadvantage the association. Maybe you keep that discipline of the straight line component method. But 9 times out of 10, the pooling method makes more sense. And I would encourage the board, if not already using that method, to pass a vote to that effect, to grant that flexibility. And your board members will appreciate that you're giving them some authority, some flexibility to deal with these projects in an easier manner than the straight line component method that may otherwise exist. For structural integrity reserve study, as relates to this legislation, any design professional or contractor who bids to perform a reserve study must disclose in writing to the association their intent to bid on any services related to any maintenance, repair, or replacement that may be recommended by the SIRS report. As a rule of thumb, if the guy that's preparing the SIRS report is also going to end up being a general contractor, to do one of the required projects, it's not a good idea, because there is obviously a financial incentive. I'm not trying to impugn the good-hearted folks who do these reports. There could be a financial incentive for them to maybe not be as accurate in the report, with the idea that, oh, I hope to get a job to do these things, so I'm going to make sure that the monies are there for that purpose, when maybe it wasn't necessary. But if that's going to happen, now there's a statutory obligation on the part of these design professionals to disclose their intention to do so upfront, which is a positive. Any design professional contractor who submits a bid for performing services recommended by the SRS may not have an interest directly or indirectly in the firm or entity providing the SIRS, or be a relative of any person having a direct or indirect interest in such firm, unless such relationship is disclosed to the association. Right. So same concept as what I just said, but this goes beyond just the author of the report. If it's the wife's contracting company, same disclosure requirement applies. New requirement that the SIRS report must include a recommendation for a reserve funding schedule based on a baseline funding plan that provides a reserve funding goal in which the reserve funding for each budget year is sufficient to maintain the reserve cash balance above zero. Okay, what does that mean? Just means you have to have sufficient reserves. You must budget for a sufficient amount of reserves for the reserve related needs over time. That's effectively what a baseline funding plan means. You can't underfund the reserves. That would not be compliant with the baseline funding plan. New requirement that if SIRS recommends reserves for a non-SIRS component, the amount of the recommended reserves for such item must be separately identified, not required. But so you have different categories of reserves, mandatory and other types of reserves, which are mandatory but can be excused upon a vote of the membership. So those types of other components that are reserve related, but they're not the mandatory structural components that are part of the SIRS. Just again, this is more for the SIRS specialists than it is for you guys, but that report needs to identify what's a mandatory reserve and what is not necessarily a mandatory reserve component. Again, this is for the reserve specialist, but just something maybe of interest. The report also has to take into account how the reserves are going to be funded, regular assessments, special assessments, lines of credits, or loans. This is a new requirement. So the takeaway, I think, from this item is you have to interface with the reserve specialist and tell them what your intended plan is as to how to pay for these things, because they have to incorporate that into the report. So share that information with the reserve specialist that's hired by the association. And the report itself must be updated to reflect the actual funding method selected. So if the report, when it's being generated, it's unclear, but it's likely, say, a special assessment's going to be used, to pay for the reserves down the road, that should be referenced. But later on, it turns out that a line of credit was chosen instead, well, then the report has to be updated with the reference to the line of credit that was used. So again, it requires you guys to interface regularly with the reserve specialist, for these purposes. All right. I do have a few more things, and if you bear with me here, we're almost done, probably 5 minutes. This is important, extends the deadline for the reserve study to be completed from December 31st, 2024, which is passed, to December 31st, 2025, right around the corner. So we got that little reprieve to finish these reports, which still only 4 or 5 months away. Be aware of that. A new requirement that an officer or director must sign an affidavit acknowledging receipt of the completed SIRS report. So this is on you guys. You have to come up with this affidavit as well. When the report is finalized, don't just shoot out an email and think you're done with your job. You have to now create an affidavit for the board member to sign. Each of the board members to sign saying, I got it, and then you notarize their signature. Hurricane protection allows an association to amend the declaration to shift the cost of any removal or reinstallation of hurricane protection, including windows and doors, if the removal is necessary for the maintenance, repair, or replacement of other condominium association property. So what does this mean? So let's say there's a concrete restoration project and the windows have to be removed because that portion of the exterior building envelope needs to be solidified, and so windows need to be taken out. So now, if there's a provision in your declaration of condominium that says this cost will be on the owner, then you can do that. But you'll need to have language in your existing declaration, or now by virtue of this legislation, you can amend your declaration to allow for that. Previously, that was not the case. Previously, if the association was engaging in a maintenance-related project and you were pulling out or damaging any type of hurricane protection that existed, which was installed by a unit owner, that was on the association to automatically have to pay for the replacement cost. But if there's language in your declaration now says otherwise, now it's going to be on the unit owner. And there's some logic behind that in the sense that you as a unit owner, take your unit subject to the association having to fulfill their maintenance obligation. That's a mandatory, non-delegable duty. And if it unfortunately means we got to pull out your beautiful impact glass, so be it. You agree to live in a condominium association, and that's just the cost of living in a high rise. Okay, almost done. Electronic voting. This is a big issue. So 718-128, a board meeting at which a resolution of the board, which a resolution of the board authorizing online voting is no longer required to be noticed 14 days. That's an easy one. That's not a big deal. Meaning, if the board is considering electronic voting, previously there was an obligation that there'd be a special 14-day notice going out to the membership for that purpose. That's not necessary. Just could go on the agenda for a regular 48-hour board of directors meeting. This is important. If at least 25% of the voting interest of a condominium petition the board to adopt a resolution for electronic voting for the next scheduled election, the board must hold a meeting within 21 days after receipt of that petition to adopt such resolution if the petition was received within 180 days after the date of the last scheduled annual meeting. Bottom line, if you got a groundswell of members in your community who really want electronic voting, and the board of directors is kind of hesitant to do so because there's costs associated with it, and that petition comes in, you have to set a meeting, and the board has to adopt a resolution authorizing electronic voting. So, that's important. My quick thought on electronic voting. Sure, it's a great idea. It sounds like it's easier. For communities with 200 members, though, it's not all it's cracked up to be, because you'll have a bifurcated approach. You're going to have some that are going to opt into electronic voting and some won't. So the night of your annual meeting, you're going to have an outside third-party vendor counting electronic votes while you're counting paper ballots over here, and you have to put those two together to come up with tallies and totals. Kind of messy. So it's not perfect. It's real good for smaller communities, 10, 12, 20 units. It makes perfect sense to save on the cost of mailing and do everything through electronic voting. Almost done. Unless the association has adopted electronic voting, the association must also designate, this is important for your annual meetings, an email address for receipt of electronically transmitted ballots. How is this changing your life in condominium association elections? Double envelope system that we're all used to, and some communities aren't so great at following it, but it's mandatory, right? Well, now in your notice, you have to provide a designated email address, giving owners the option to email in their ballot and circumvent the double envelope system that we all live by for so long. And if someone sends in their ballot with a whole bunch of disclaimers, have to be included, by the way, in the ballot itself, including the fact that they're agreeing that there's not going to be anonymity as it relates to who they voted for, right? Because the whole purpose of the double envelope system is to pull out the inner envelope without any names on it associated with the particular vote, so no one knows who voted for who, which makes a lot of sense. But this new system now, providing people a designated email address where they could fire in their ballot without having to send in the double envelope, now people are going to know who voted for who. So there's a required disclosure that and the owner is acknowledging, saying, I'm fine with this. I get it. I don't care if people know who I voted for, but I'm going to vote in this particular method as opposed to the double envelope. So that's a big change that has to be incorporated into your annual meeting notices that go out. I'm sure your annual meeting's probably towards the end of the year, but be aware of that. Check with counsel, have them help you prepare these notices and prepare the required disclosures. That's all I got, guys. I hope I filled you up with some knowledge and some information. Once again, I very much appreciate the opportunity to meet all you. Hopefully, develop a deeper relationship with Affinity.